rolling in
Yeah.
right now. So we're gonna have a few cold days over the next few days, but relatively rare to get a particularly frosty overnight.
Yeah. They have to spray the oranges and do all that.
So thanks
So
for
why
being
is
on
everything
early,
frozen?
everyone. You've made it the right spot. If you're looking for the AMA, we will get started in just 2 minutes, but we're having some catch-up time between Dana and Dr. Mann here as we get started. And I'll put in the chat where you can start getting your questions all set up. But sit back, settle in, and you're in for a real treat here tonight, everyone. Thanks for being here early. And I don't need to cut you two off. Keep on catching up here. I just know that I wanted to make sure people knew they're in the right spot.
All sounds good.
Yeah.
We've got 2 minutes or so to go, and then, yeah.
All right, so here is where also we'll put a link where you can add your climate science questions and upvote others right here in the chat, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We've got Colorado, New Jersey, Texas represented so far. Excellent to see you, Bob and Victoria. Thanks for being here. And Jim, we won't be able to unraise people's hands, but you can start posing your questions in the Q&A that I've just linked to with Poll EV. So that should be open for everyone to upvote each other's questions. Feel free.
I guess the downside with using the YouTube live stream is that we can't see all those folks in the Zoom chat.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's why we're doing the Poll EV though, so we can handle both.
Sure.
All right, so let's jump right in. Actually, we are right at the top of the hour, and we are so honored to have the esteemed Dr. Michael Mann with us tonight as our Climate Science AMA. So I'm actually just going to do a quick housekeeping slide and then pass it to Dana to do our intro and facilitate a wonderful dialogue here tonight. But you are in the right spot if you're looking for tonight's Climate Science Ask Me Anything. We are recording this training. It will be available in CCL Community after tonight, as well as our YouTube channel. I'll put a link to those in just a moment in our chat stream. All lines are muted right now. You're welcome to share where you're calling in from in the chat, but we're routing people to Poll EV for questions so that everyone, since we're having so many people, can upvote what they're most wanting to know from Dr. Mann and be efficient with time. Just go to pollev.com/CCL123, and from there you'll be able to see all of the other questions people have already put in and upvote your favorites. The format's going to be really straightforward. We're going to have a great discussion and then time for a lot of interaction and Q&A. So with that, I will get out of the way. We are so honored to have our esteemed guest here tonight. And Dana, take it away to introduce Dr. Mann.
All right. Yeah, we're super lucky to have Mike here. He is a climate scientist, professor of atmospheric science at Penn State. Last year, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. So that's a super prestigious thing to happen. He's won tons and tons of awards. I'm going to highlight his National Center for Science Education Friend of the Planet Award because I got that one a couple of years later. So that's the one award I can say I share with Michael Mann.
Well deserved, my friend.
Thanks, Mike. He's published a bunch of books in addition to his probably hundreds of peer-reviewed climate science papers. If you can zoom in on his behind his head there, you can probably see most of the books that he's published. Let's see, he had the Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, which was about his famous climate stick, hockey stick study, and then the sort of attacks that were descended upon him by the fossil fuel industry for having the temerity to publish that great scientific paper. Let's see, he had the Madhouse Effect with Tom Towles, who recently retired, the cartoonist from the Washington Post, who's done some really great stuff. So that's a really cool book to be able to collaborate with Tom Towles. Dire Predictions was another one. And then his latest one is The New Climate War, which I've been enjoying. I've been reading it. So it's kind of about the strategies that various polluting industries have used to shift the responsibility for their pollution onto individuals, and then kind of what Mike sees as strategies to combat that. So Mike, do you want to kind of give us about a summary of those?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can talk more about the latest book and sort of the message of the latest book. I think it'll naturally sort of dovetail with our conversation tonight, because it really relates to a lot of the things that are playing out as we speak. In fact, tomorrow, of course, Joe Biden is going to announce a number of executive actions on climate. It's a very exciting time if you're somebody who actually wants to see forward progress on climate. But first, before we get going, I wanted to thank Brett and CCL, both for sponsoring this forum, but more generally for the important work that they are doing. CCL, of course, has really engaged a very broad coalition of people of all stripes, who, conservatives, progressives across the political spectrum, who all agree that we need to do something about climate and are looking for common ground in how we can go about actually instituting policies to do something about climate. And it's an exciting time, as I said, because we're now in a position, both with the incoming presidential or the new presidential administration, I have to get used to that. They're not incoming anymore, they're here. And the new Congress, which has Democratic control in both houses of Congress, and where we will likely see climate legislation not only make it to the Senate floor, but I think actually pass the Senate over the next couple of years. And a lot of the sort of the groundwork over the past several years by CCL, the groundwork that they've laid has really created, I think, an opportune moment here when it comes to climate policy. So thanks to Brett, thanks to CCL, and thanks to Dana, a fellow, a brother in arms, I would say, in the climate wars. Dana has done a magnificent job combating climate change denialism, both in the column that you had in the Guardian, and you still do pieces in the Guardian about climate science and combating climate change denial, your role in skeptical science, which has grown into this very important source of information for people looking to inform our public discourse and to combat misinformation and disinformation. And really, thanks to efforts by folks like Dana, by skeptical science, and by this large community of people now who've been pushing back against the anti-science and the myths, the climate myths. We're now at a point where I think that's largely behind us. I think climate change denial is largely in our rearview mirror. That is a message really of the new climate war, that we've essentially won that battle, and that's the old climate war. But we do face new challenges as we go forward and we try to actually do something about climate. The forces of inaction, I call them the inactivists in the book, fossil fuel interests, those who are doing their bidding. They haven't simply rolled over. They haven't given up the fight. Instead, they've turned to a whole new array of tactics that aren't really now focused on denying the science and denying the evidence, but in deflecting our attention from real solutions, or dividing us and getting us fighting with each other so we don't represent a united front demanding change, or deflecting attention away from the needed systemic changes towards individual lifestyle, behavioral choices. These are some of the tactics that we see now by the forces of inaction. And that's really the focus of the new climate war, because we are at this very important juncture right now. We're so close. And I know, Dana and others, we all feel like we've been working on this for so long now, and it's felt like we've been pushing this huge boulder uphill. And now that boulder is sort of, it's at the top of the hill. It's ready to go down that hill. It's a very exciting time, but it's so important now, because we're so close, to recognize the obstacles that still do exist, that are being thrown in our path, again, by the forces of inaction. And that's really the purpose of the book, to help people recognize and fight back against the tactics that are being used in this sort of last-ditch effort now to block our forward progress on climate. So that's my spiel. And I'll turn it over to Dana, and I guess we'll just sort of get into a conversation and then open it up to the Q&A with the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I've felt the exact same way, that climate science denial has kind of lost all of its traction at this point, and now all the denial is really shifted onto solutions denial and saying, everything's too expensive, or if we try to implement some policy. If like if we stop the Keystone Pipeline, we're going to lose thousands of jobs and myths like that, as opposed to basic science denial myths, which are pretty rare at this point. And when they are espoused, then they don't get much traction anymore. So that's been nice to see that we're actually making some progress into getting into at least discussions about solutions instead of getting bogged down into science denial all the time.
No, absolutely. And there's another book coming out next month in February by Bill Gates. And in fact, it takes a pretty technocratic approach to climate solutions. It really advocates for things like geoengineering, things that I don't think are part of a smart path forward on climate. And so there still are contrasting views out there about the path forward. But hey, let's have that debate, because that's a worthy debate. There isn't a worthy debate to be had about whether climate change is real, or whether it's caused by human activity, or whether it is now subjecting us to increased risks that we can see play out in real time. In fact, before we got going here, Dana and I were chatting. Dana lives in Sacramento, where they've gone from one extreme to the next, from heat and drought and unprecedented wildfires to now an atmospheric river that's bringing in huge amounts of rainfall. And this is something we expect in a warmer atmosphere that can hold more moisture, even if it rains less often. When it does rain in places like Northern California, you'll get more of it in short periods of time, and you'll get mudslides because of all that, the ground, the surface, the soils that have been disrupted from the burning vegetation, the loss of roots. And so the soil has lost its integrity because of those wildfires, more erosion, and then you get these epic mudslides when the rains finally come. So none of us can escape the impacts of climate change. We're all dealing with it now in real time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think given our audience tonight, we should probably mention that Citizens Climate Lobby is mentioned a little bit in your book, and there's a little bit of discussion of carbon fee and dividend in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for asking about that, because this has become, again, I talk about how the forces of inaction have tried to divide us. And one of the things they've tried to do is to divide us on climate solutions. And ironically, even though in the past, much of the opposition to carbon pricing, to sort of ways of forcing the fossil fuel industry to pay for the damage that they're doing, to level the playing field, so that renewable energy, which isn't doing the same damage to us and the planet, can compete fairly in the marketplace. And carbon pricing is an important tool in our toolbox, and we have to use all the tools that are available. Nobody's saying carbon pricing is the magic bullet. We need carbon pricing, we need green stimulus, subsidies for renewable energy. We've got to stop green lighting, the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, things that we're actually seeing right now in the new administration taking action on all these fronts. We need to deploy all of these solutions, but carbon pricing is an important tool. I think it's an essential tool. And one of the things that the activists have very effectively done is actually turn some climate progressives against climate pricing, based on what I argue really is a myth that carbon pricing is inconsistent with a just transition, that the costs will somehow fall primarily upon lower income workers and families and frontline communities. And that at all doesn't have to be the case if it's implemented in a progressive way. And of course, CCL has advocated for a fee and dividend where revenue is returned to the people in a progressive way. And something similar has been done in Australia. It was working very well until the conservative government and the Murdoch media got rid of their emissions trading scheme. But under their scheme, carbon emissions came down almost immediately, about 10%, a pretty big amount in less than a year. And prices only went up a little bit in certain sectors. But if you were at the lower end of the income spectrum, you actually gained because of the money that was returned, the revenue that was returned to citizens. People, low-income workers, low-income families actually benefited, not just from a cleaner environment and the action, the reduction in carbon emissions, and the action, the progress that we were making on climate, but they gained financially. And that has been true in Canada, where carbon pricing has been implemented. So carbon pricing can be done in a progressive way. And nobody's saying it is the single unique magic bullet that's going to solve the problem. But I believe firmly that it is part of the solution. And I, applaud CCL and Dana and the others who have worked with CCL for years now in really trying to push through and trying to convince people across the political spectrum that this is a sensible way to, attack this problem, to attack the climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, another key aspect of carbon pricing is that it can fit through into budget reconciliation, which is going to be probably the way anything significant gets through the Senate right now. So it's actually something I wrote about for Yale Climate Connections a couple days ago.
Excellent. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's very exciting. In fact, in an interview yesterday, Chuck Schumer, the new Senate Majority Leader, actually explicitly said, we're going to use reconciliation to pass climate legislation.
Yeah.
Also, an interesting other interesting news was sort of made. There was an implication that there's a possibility that the president will declare a climate emergency. And this is a real emergency, unlike, the wall that Donald Trump argued he could use the discretion emergency funding as president to fund. That wasn't a real crisis. In fact, the crisis was, the construction of the wall. But climate change is a real crisis. It is a real emergency. And it's actually legitimate use of the emergency powers of a president. The communications director for the president today was asked about that, and the answer she gave was sort of a bit nebulous. So we don't really know yet if they're planning to pursue that, but there are a number of possible avenues that this administration can pursue, especially with a Democratic House and Senate working together to advance some sort of climate legislation, perhaps through reconciliation, but perhaps not. Perhaps maybe we get 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Republicans, moderate Republicans, people that CCL volunteers have been lobbying when they go to Washington, D.C. to meet with their Congress people. Maybe we do get, as many as a dozen Republicans in this new political atmosphere, this post-Trump political atmosphere, who do join with Democrats to support meaningful climate legislation. It probably won't be an expansive Green New Deal like what AOC and Ed Markey have proposed. We're probably not going to see anything that expansive pass a 50-50 Senate, but I think we will see meaningful climate legislation, and that will complement the executive actions that are being taken by the new administration.
Yeah, that would be great. And it was actually Chuck Schumer who suggested that Biden declare a climate emergency. So it's coming from top tiers of the Democratic Party. So that's really interesting to see. Yeah. All right, Mike, you ready to get some questions?
Let's do it. And Dana, you feel free to weigh in too. We're partners here in this. So yeah.
Sounds good. So if everybody wants to ask questions or vote on which questions get asked, you go to pollev.com/CCL123. Hopefully you can see it at the top of the screen here. So the top voted question so far, see here. The IPCC now says that any path below 1.5 degrees Celsius must include carbon capture. With worsening climate change and cheaper carbon capture, are we at the point where you think it's worth it? If so, what about the moral hazard of carbon capture?
Yeah, great question. I'm not convinced that that's actually true. It does require negative net emissions, but one of the things we now understand is that if we stop burning carbon, if carbon emissions go to zero, we will achieve negative net emissions as the oceans and the biosphere continue to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So, there are some uncertainties in all of those mechanisms. And there's enough uncertainty that, we don't know. It's possible that that those negative emissions may be achieved through natural uptake, perhaps enhanced by massive reforestation, afforestation, supplemented by regenerative agriculture. So, there are ways of, there are modes of natural uptake of carbon that don't require us to use sort of geoengineering technology. And there is a potential moral hazard, as the questioner points out here, because to the extent that we think we can rely upon negative emissions down the road, it sort of takes the pressure off of reducing carbon emissions as quickly as arguably we need to right now. And I think we have to be very aware of how that, along with, for example, geoengineering, can be used as a crutch for those who still want to see us, at least in the near term, remain addicted to fossil fuels. Again, those forces of inaction, fossil fuel interests who are making billions and billions of dollars profits. Every year we remain addicted to fossil fuels. They want to keep us addicted to them as long as they can. And anything that kicks the can down the road, promise of future negative emissions, takes some of the near-term pressure off, and of course, favors that agenda of near-term reliance on carbon emissions. So there is a real moral hazard there when it comes to carbon capture. Now I'm talking about direct air capture. If we introduce, say, carbon capture and sequestration into the conversation, then it becomes even more problematic because you're burning fossil fuels. You're trying to capture the CO2 that's released, but you're not going to capture all of it, even in the best of situations, in the sort of, trial, experiments that have been done thus far. Just about the best that we ever see is maybe 90% capture. And so if you're burning, gigatons of carbon and you're only capturing 90% of it, that 10% of a gigaton is still a large amount of carbon, and we will blow through our carbon budget for keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I don't think CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, coal burning with carbon capture and sequestration, is really a viable strategy going forward. It displaces, it crowds out investment in better solutions, which are renewable energy. And in fact, Mark Jacobson of Stanford has published work demonstrating that if you do sort of a full cost accounting and you look at this crowding out problem, to the extent that we put investment into direct air capture and CCS, we're actually displacing a better solution, a carbon friendlier solution, which is renewable energy. And he's demonstrated that, in particular, when you take into account some of the health consequences of continuing to burn fossil fuels, it just doesn't make sense if you do a full cost accounting. So I'm very skeptical of the idea that direct air capture and CCS can be deployed in a way that allows us to continue to burn fossil fuels and still solve this problem. We could go on and on about this, but I know there are a whole bunch of questions, so I'll leave it there. But Dana, if there's anything you want to add, please do so.
Yeah, I just feel like when people talk about carbon capture, they often don't distinguish between those two, between direct air capture, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and carbon capture and sequestration, when you're usually at the smokestack, capturing the carbon when it's released from the burning of the fossil fuels. So that's an important thing to want to distinguish between those two.
Absolutely. And
yeah.
Nice job doing that.
Yeah, and I think a direct air capture, the nice thing, as you discussed, like there are natural ways to do it with agriculture, with planting trees, things like that. And potentially maybe there'll down the line be technologies that will hopefully become cost effective so that we can kind of supplement those natural methods while keeping our eye on the ball with reducing emissions, focusing on reducing the emissions to begin with, so that there's less in the atmosphere that needs to be pulled out.
Absolutely right. We should continue the research and development, and we may want to deploy some of these tools down the road, especially if we decide we want to bring CO2 back down to where it was before we started burning fossil fuels, not just, or at least down to levels that existed in the mid 20th century, 350 parts per million, for example, to get back down to 350 ppm. And we're right now at over 410 ppm. Obviously, we would need to take substantial amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere. Reforestation, afforestation, natural methods alone probably won't do that. Maybe down the road, there will be safe technology. After we stop burning fossil fuels, it makes sense to be doing those things, but we don't want to be crowding out investment in the real solutions by putting too much effort and money into these particular approaches.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, let's see what else we've got. We've heard recently that atmospheric CO2 will decrease in temperature when emissions go to zero. I thought we'd have to reduce atmospheric CO2 while we reduce emissions of CO2. So I think this is the confusion between once we get to net zero emissions, will that warming in the pipeline continue, temperatures going up, or will temperatures flatten out at that point?
Yeah, so this is an area where there's been quite a bit of progress in the science over the last decade or so, but I don't think that the science has really been very well explained to the general public. And because of that, there's still a myth when it comes to the issue of what we call committed warming. So in the old days, 10 years ago, we would run climate change experiments where we would take a climate model and we would treat carbon dioxide as a control knob that we just turn up in the model. We just increase the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. And when you do that and you increase it to some level and you stop there, the surface of the planet continues to warm up for several decades because the oceans in particular have a large amount of thermal mass, thermal inertia. And they're absorbing that heat and the surface continues to warm up. And so they warm up for several decades after you stop turning the CO2 knob up. That's a really artificial experiment because that's not what happens in the real world. We don't have our hand on the CO2 knob. What we can control is the emissions of carbon, CO2, into the atmosphere. And when we put CO2 into the atmosphere, some of it stays in the atmosphere, about half of it, but about half of it actually gets taken back out of the atmosphere by plants, the terrestrial biosphere, and the oceans. And so if you stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, so you stop the input of CO2 into the atmosphere, and you let the system respond to it, it will continue to draw that CO2 back down out of the atmosphere. The oceans and the terrestrial biosphere will continue to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. So that actually brings CO2 concentrations down. This is why we eventually get negative net carbon emissions if we stop burning carbon, because the oceans continue to draw down that CO2. And if we're not putting any into the atmosphere, it's sort of like a sink that started out level. Well, let's say we'll make it a little more complicated. We've got the water level stays the same, it stays level. We've got the faucet on and water's coming in, but we've got the drain open and the same amount of water's going out and the water level stays fixed. Now, what happens if we turn the faucet off? Well, then the water level goes down because the drain is still pulling CO2, pulling water out of our sink. Well, that's what's happening with CO2. And so we do actually get drawdown of CO2. We do get these negative net emissions if we stop burning carbon. And that's a bit of good news. What it means is that surface temperatures stabilize within a few years after you stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, because that committed warming, which would cause an increase for decades, is offset by this drawdown of carbon dioxide by the oceans. Those two effects basically cancel out and you get pretty much a flat line. If you stop burning carbon now, surface temperatures stabilize at the level that they're at. This is, by the way, why we can define a carbon budget. The only reason it makes sense to say there's a certain amount of carbon that we can burn and remain below, say, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius is because of this new understanding of how the system works. And what that means is that there is a direct response, an immediate response to our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. In a sense, that's an empowering piece of information. And it's something that I often point out when people sort of focus on mythical runaway warming scenarios and sort of doom sort of mongering based on distortions of what the science actually has to say. If you look at what the science says, it tells us that we can stop surface warming very quickly if we stop burning carbon, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I find it to be really a relief that we know once we get to zero emissions, then temperatures will basically stop rising. And that's given us a really good target to aim for, is to get to that net zero.
It does, and at the expense or at the risk of being accused of being a Pollyanna, let me point out that there are some components of the climate system that don't stop immediately. We do worry that we set in motion the collapse of the ice shelves and the destabilization of the ice sheets. Ocean acidification increases for decades. And so there are things that continue to get worse. If we can keep all of those changes within a manageable sort of range, if we can slow down the warming, bring it to a standstill, hopefully we can keep these other impacts sort of within a range that we can adapt to. If we can slow down sea level rise, we can't stop it, but we can in principle adapt to it, and other living things can adapt to it. So right now it's about bringing our emissions down as quickly as possible, stopping the surface warming as soon as possible, and slowing down everything else to a rate that we can ultimately adapt to.
Okay. So next one, what are your thoughts on mandatory environmental education in schools, and what are the psychological ways in which we can help school children prepare for handling climate change?
Well, climate science is now part of the recommended Common Core of classes. And so it is a part of the recommended curriculum for, I believe, grade school through high school. And unfortunately, we still encounter resistance in the same way that the teaching of evolution in schools encountered resistance from the advocates of young earth creationism and intelligent design. The teaching of climate science has encountered resistance in conservative communities, or communities where there is sort of a vocal minority of climate change deniers who get onto the school board or who put pressure on the school board. Fortunately, as Dana knows, we have an organization centered here in Oakland, California, called the National Center for Science Education. It's the organization that granted Dana the Friend of the Planet Award for his outreach, for his communication efforts, an award that I'm proud to have received from them as well. And they help schools, they help school teachers, school systems, K through 12 education, deal with the challenges that that teachers still encounter when it comes to the teaching of evolution and the teaching of climate science. So it's part of the recommended curriculum, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen by default. There are still efforts to push back against that. The inactivists, the forces of climate inaction, fossil fuel interests, those advancing their agenda, have been very effective in sort of working their tendrils down into civil society, influencing school boards, preventing the teaching of climate science in school systems. And so we need to recognize that that effort, that pushback still exists. And fortunately, there are organizations like NCSE that we can support. You can go online, contribute, join, please do. They're helping us fight that battle to make sure that those who will inherit the worst impacts of climate change if we don't act, our children and grandchildren, they deserve to be fully informed of the risks and the threats of climate change.
What about ways to help kids prepare for handling climate change? I mean, I know you've been a big advocate for the kids sort of, spurring action to address the problem.
Yeah, you can't see it. One of my books up here, hold on.
I have to get up. The tantrum that saved the world, was that it?
That is it. Here we go. Tantrum That Saved the World is a book I co-authored with a children's illustrator and writer, Megan Herbert. that tells a story, and I won't give it away, but it's about a girl who gets very frustrated when these displaced animals displaced by climate change, like polar bears, start showing up at her door. And she, throws a tantrum, but it turns into this very empowering tantrum. It turns into a journey that, by her to be the change that she wishes to see in the world. And it ends up that she, this child ends up changing the way the adults in the world and our opinion leaders and politicians at the highest levels of government view this problem. And it spurs action on their part. I'm proud to say that this book was actually written several years ago, before the rise of the youth climate movement and Greta Thunberg and her fellow youth climate advocates. So it's sort of an example of life imitating art in a very profound way. Originally, the book was self-published by Megan. We now have a major distributor that's taken it up. So it will be released at a much larger scale sometime later this year. So look out for it. It's a great book to read if you have children in the age of anywhere from like 5 to 10 years. The story is really accessible to the youngest, to any of the children in that age range. And then there's supplementary information. They can learn a little bit more about the science behind how climate change is impacting the different characters in a supplementary section that's more for sort of the older 8, 9, 10-year-old kids. But you can actually go online. Grist did this wonderful video where they read the book to a class of, I think they were first grade students, and you can see their reactions. It's a lot of fun. It's online at the Grist website. So yeah, we have to inform them. We have to make sure that they are, that they understand the crisis. They understand that this is something we need to do, because they need to put pressure on the adults in their world to act. Sometimes learning comes from the younger folks upward. It isn't always from the older folks downward. Sometimes parents and adults learn affective learning, emotional learning from their children. And when you read a book like this with your children, sort of like I remember when my mother read the Lorax to me when I was a young child, and it inspired me about, the larger environmental challenges and crises we face. That's the hope, that children can read this book with their parents, and creates awareness, but we have to make sure it's engaging. And we talked about this before we started, sort of the tagline of my new book, and it's something that I've been sort of saying a lot these days, is that we need both a sense of urgency, but also agency. We must act now. We are in a crisis situation, but we have the tools to act, and it isn't too late to act. And we have to make sure that when we talk to children about this, that we explain that there's a problem, but there's a solution. And I don't know if you remember, but the Lorax ends on a sort of on a hopeful note, and as does this book. And I think that we do need to leave our children with the legitimate hope that does exist, because it isn't too late, and we shouldn't be telling them otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. I think empowering kids is just a great message and a great way to handle that. All right, next question. How do you see big businesses' views changing about their impact on climate change? We're seeing a lot of corporations issuing statements in support of reducing emissions, also in support of carbon pricing recently. But do you think these words will translate into action, and how quickly?
Yeah, I do. I see there's some good news, certainly in certain sectors. Obviously, there are certain sectors like the reinsurance and insurance industry where, they have huge exposure when it comes to the impacts of climate change. And, we've seen reinsurance companies playing a very prominent role in expressing concern about climate change, raising awareness about the threat of climate change. The finance industry has really come a long way. And this is really important in sort of banking and finance. because fossil fuel infrastructure requires financing. And if the finance community recognizes that this is not a viable way forward, that these are bad long-term investments, there's no economy on a dead planet. So investing in fossil fuel infrastructure is a bad long-term investment. And the finance community is really coming around to this. And there's sort of two different components that have to be treated differently, two different kinds of risk that they're dealing with and confronting. One is what we call transition risk. A fossil fuel company is becoming a really bad investment because they are going to need to leave most of their assets stranded. There's 5 times as much carbon in the proven assets of fossil fuel companies right now beneath the ground that are available to them, 5 times as much carbon as is necessary to warm the planet beyond a catastrophic 2 degrees Celsius warming. And even obviously the challenge of keeping it below 1.5 degrees Celsius is even greater. So we are going to, the assumption is we're going to act, and we're already seeing that action globally. And we're sort of, it's a new dawn now in the United States when it comes to climate action. And tomorrow we're going to hear a number of very important executive actions from the new administration, from the Biden administration. And one of them is going to be no longer allowing fossil fuel companies to drill on public lands, to extract fossil fuels on public lands. I think we'll also be hearing about how the Treasury Department, we may see some actions on the part of Janet Yellen, the new Treasury Secretary in the Treasury Department, where now climate liability and climate risk will be something that's taken into account in deciding whether you can get a federal loan, federal financing. So transition risk. If we decide we've got to leave fossil fuels in the ground, the fossil fuel companies are bad investments. We shouldn't be investing in them and providing them financing for new fossil fuel infrastructure. Then there's also what they call physical risk. And that's sort of what I was alluding to before. We all lose out in a world of unmitigated climate change, an almost dystopian world where we see severe impacts basically on the viability of human civilization. Obviously, that's going to be extremely damaging to an economy. If you don't have a civilization, you don't have an economy. One other thing I would throw out there, if you're interested in these sorts of arguments and how they might play out in the future, the science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, has written a new book. I had a chance to talk with him in an event a couple months ago, and we're going to do another one in March because sort of his fictional story reinforces a lot of the points that I make in my nonfiction book. But he tells a fictional tale of a world where we do seize control of financing and we recognize how to use tools like financing and carbon pricing to get the transition that we need towards a sustainable world, towards a just world, towards a better world. The Ministry for the Future is the name of the book. And he gets actually quite a bit into the issue of financing and the role of the finance industry. And we're seeing a lot of progress there. We've seen companies like BlackRock, the president of Bank of England a year ago or so, making statements warning that we are going to start pulling investments out of these sectors because we see them as extremely risky investments.
Yeah, I mean, it's really helped that just the costs of clean technologies have plummeted. So they're just the smart investments at this point too, as opposed to fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to, I like to quote this gentleman whose name seems to have been lost, but supposedly from the fossil fuel industry, who once famously said that the Stone Age didn't end for want of stones, right? And the fossil fuel age won't end for want of fossil fuels. It won't end because we've literally run out of fossil fuels. It'll end because something better has come along, And we know what that better thing is. That's renewable energy, that's clean energy. The problem is just leaving the market to its own without incorporating the externality, the damage that climate change is doing through some sort of price signal. That transition won't happen fast enough. It will happen. We will transition fully to clean energy. I'm sure of that. We just won't do it fast enough without a price signal. And that's why, again, the work of CCL, the idea that we need carbon pricing and we need subsidies for renewables, we need to level that playing field so that that transition happens faster.
Okay, Mike, tipping point question. What are your latest views on the risk of tipping points as we pass 1.5 going towards 2 degrees?
So, there is sort of an idea of tipping points out there in sort of the public climate discourse that I think is misleading. There's this notion that there's a tipping point at 1.5 degrees Celsius, or there's a tipping point at 2 degrees Celsius. That's not really where these targets come from. What these targets, correspond to is if we look at the aggregate impacts of climate change and the negative impacts in different sectors of society and our economy, things get worse and worse as we warm the planet more and more. And at 1.5 degrees Celsius, things get pretty bad. At 2 degrees Celsius, they get even worse. So it's really more like, it's not a tipping point, it's not a cliff that we go off at 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. I like to think of it as a dangerous highway that we're driving down. And the farther we go down that highway, the more danger we encounter. So we want to get off at the earliest exit we can. And we'd like it to be the 1.5 degrees Celsius exit. But if we miss that exit, we don't just continue headlong down the highway. We get off at the next exit. We get off at the 2 degrees Celsius exit. Every bit of carbon that we don't burn warms the planet less, leads to less of an increase in the impacts of climate change, and makes us better off. So we want to get off at the earliest exit we possibly can. Now, when it comes to tipping points, there are tipping point components in the climate system. These are sort of irreversible responses where once something happens, you can't undo it. It's like a boulder at the top of the hill. Once you push it past the top of the hill, it keeps on going. There are components in the climate system that behave this way. Once you get the major ice sheets melting, once you destabilize the ice shelves and they start collapsing and the ice starts surging out to sea, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop that from proceeding. So this is one of the impacts that we really worry about. Passing a tipping point where we've warmed the planet enough, we've warmed the Southern Ocean enough to destabilize those ice shelves that prop up the West Antarctic ice sheet. And there's enough ice there to give us 20 or more feet of sea level rise. There's enough ice in Greenland to give us 20 or so feet of sea level rise. Once we set those things in motion, they may be unstoppable. We don't know exactly where those thresholds are, but we know that we're getting closer and closer with every additional bit of carbon pollution we put into the atmosphere and every additional amount of warming that we bake into the climate system. There are other tipping points that may actually be playing out. A few years ago, actually it's more like 5 years ago, my colleague Stefan Rahmstorf of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Studies in Germany and a number of co-authors, including myself, published an article in the journal Nature Climate Change where we demonstrated that the so-called ocean conveyor belt, we sometimes equate this with the Gulf Stream, but it's actually the extension of the Gulf Stream, the warm water that travels up towards Iceland and Europe. It's a warm current that's driven by the sinking of cold, dense waters in the polar regions of the North Atlantic. And if you melt a lot of ice and that water flows out into the North Atlantic, then it's fresher, and so it's lighter, and you inhibit that sinking motion that drives this global conveyor belt. We think that that's actually underway. We think that it is now slowing down. The models actually predicted that we wouldn't see that perhaps for another century, and yet we're seeing it now. We think it's because we're seeing Greenland melt take place much earlier than the models originally envisioned it happening. So it's a message that, far from being the alarmists that our critics like to accuse us of, if anything, the climate science community in our predictions, in our models, in our prognostications, we've been conservative, perhaps overly conservative. And uncertainty is not an argument for inaction. If anything, it's an argument for even more concerted action, because the uncertainties don't necessarily play out in our favor. They may very well be playing out against our favor.
So we actually had a question specifically about that. So I popped that up. What's the latest science on the slowing of the thermohaline and on the weakening of the jet stream, which is a topic that I think is particularly interesting.
Thanks very much. And so the second part of that, we've sort of knocked that off.
Yeah,
so I'll take that off the table. And these are two different problems. They're both very interesting problems. And they're both examples, in my view, of where the science has been too conservative, where our models have underestimated how these impacts are playing out. I just described why we think that's the case with the slowdown of the thermohaline. That's another word for the conveyor belt ocean circulation. Thermohaline means temperature and salt. Those are the two main factors that influence ocean density and the sinking of those waters. So the melting of Greenland is taking place earlier than the models predicted, and that means the freshening is happening earlier and the thermohaline circulation is slowing down earlier. We think that that may be what's happening there. With the jet stream, now I've done some work on this. My work on the jet stream has really been looking at the behavior of the jet stream during the Northern Hemisphere summer, when the temperature contrasts between the equator and the pole are weaker. What drives the jet stream, the reason for its existence, is the difference between temperatures in the warm subtropics and the cold polar region. And that difference in temperature, for reasons that involve atmospheric physics that I'm not going to go into, lead to the buildup of very strong westerly winds, winds from the west, in mid-latitudes, at latitudes of 45, 50 degrees or so north, centered at what we call the tropopause, the boundary between the troposphere, which is the part of the atmosphere we live in, where temperatures cool as you go up. But once you get into the next layer up, the stratosphere, where jets fly, temperatures start increasing as you go up. And that has to do in part with the absorption of sunlight by ozone. In any case, that separates these two layers. And at the boundary between those two layers, at a latitude roughly 45 degrees, sits the core of the jet stream. But those westerly winds, those winds from the west, extend all the way down to the surface. And we feel them as westerly winds, prevailing winds that blow from the west to east over large parts of the United States, particularly strong in winter, because that's when the temperature contrast is strongest. In the summer, those temperature differences are smaller. It gets much warmer in the summer in the Arctic. The subtropics don't warm up that much. And so you decrease that temperature contrast. That means you decrease the strength of the jet stream. Well, the jet stream is moving those weather systems along, those lows and highs, the high pressure systems that we associate in the summer that have been stuck over California, giving Dana and other Californians the drought, the heat, and the wildfires, that very persistent ridge, we call it, high pressure dome. And back east at the same time, summer 2018, when you were seeing record wildfires, heat, and drought, back east, we had the wettest summer we've ever had here in Pennsylvania and a large part of the eastern US. Because your high was stuck out there, we had a low stuck here. And those weather systems tend to get stuck in place when the jet stream slows down and doesn't push them along. And so we've done some work suggesting, and it turns out it's more complicated than that. In fact, to really solve this problem, you have to use the mathematics that was developed to solve problems in quantum mechanics in the early 1900s. So it's actually a pretty complicated physics problem, and it's complicated enough, and the processes that are involved are small enough in scale that the climate models we use to project future extreme weather events, as we've shown in our work, don't actually resolve that physics very well. So we can't entirely depend on current generation climate models to capture these mechanisms. And we think that the models are underestimating, for this reason, the impact that climate change is having on these very persistent weather extremes. And I know that there's a dog that agrees with me. I can hear him or her barking along in agreement. Perhaps, or maybe that's a comment. Maybe he's planning on publishing a a critical reply to our paper. In any case, that is fairly new science. That's sort of at the forefront of our understanding. We don't yet have the models running at a resolution where we're confident that they can really handle the physics that are involved. And so it's another reason for caution. It's another reason to suspect that the models may be underestimating the impact that climate change is already having on these devastating extreme weather events. And the models may be underestimating the potential increases in the future as we continue to warm the planet. So both of these are sort of cautionary tales. The slowing of the thermohaline circulation, the increase in these very persistent extreme weather events in the summer, both examples of where the models may be underestimating because of the missing physics or the incompletely resolved physics, missing some of the physics that explains how these things play out in the real world. And so uncertainty, once again, not a reason for not a reason, not a cause for inaction. If anything, uncertainty is a cause for greater action.
Okay, so we got time for one or two more. I'm gonna pick this one. What's your feeling about complacency versus denial? Which one's a bigger problem?
Yes, it's a great question. It really does come down, in a sense, to that same duality, that same competition, that same sort of give and take between urgency and agency. Denial can take many forms, and denial of the basic scientific evidence, as Dana and I were talking earlier in this conversation, we think that's really on the wane. Why is it on the wane? Because look, if you live in Sacramento, you live in State College, Pennsylvania, you live just about anywhere. The Western US, the Gulf Coast, Puerto Rico, low-lying island nations, Europe, the extreme weather events we've seen, unprecedented heat waves and droughts and wildfires. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I am sorry, I should have disabled that. The impacts of climate change have become so obvious to the person on the street that you just can't deny that they're happening. So that sort of denial is increasingly a non-factor. It's a fringe sort of part of the conversation, and it's not getting a lot of mainstream play anymore, outright science denial. But there's another form of denial that I've become very concerned about, denial of the possibility of doing anything about the problem. That is what I equate with sort of doom or despair mongering. And I talk quite a bit about this in the book, in the new climate war, because this is one of the new fronts in the new climate war. One of the ways that the forces of inaction have tried to convince some, have tried to, in essence, disengage part of the environmental community is by convincing them that it's too late to do anything anyways. So why bother? If you really believe that there's nothing left we can do, then it potentially leads you down the same path of inaction as outright denial of the evidence. And there are people of good faith, of goodwill, who have fallen victim to this framing, but the sort of the flames of despair mongering and by bad actors, especially state actors like Russia, who've used bot armies and trolls online to try to promote this framing that it's too late to do anything about climate change. It's a very insidious and nefarious way of disengaging people who would otherwise be on the front lines arguing for action, environmental activists. And so we have to look out for that. We have to look out for people who have fallen victim to that campaign. I think it's a much bigger problem than outright denial. But complacency is a problem too, right? So we need to be aware that there is an urgent problem. And we talked a little bit earlier, it looks like the President Biden may in fact declare a climate emergency. And certainly that's the very opposite of complacency. At the very top level of our government, the commander-in-chief saying this is an emergency. We need that sort of messaging. We need to draw upon the resources that become available to deal with something that is an emergency, like the climate emergency. But we need people to recognize that this is an urgent problem. But what we can't do is buy into this false notion that it's too late. And let me say, by the way, that the sort of the despair mongering that I'm talking about is almost always based on a distortion of the science that Dana and I can tell you is every bit as bad as the distortions of the science on the climate change denial side of things. You hear the claim that warming has released such large amounts of methane from the Arctic that we're now undergoing a runaway warming that can't be stopped, and all life on Earth will be gone in less than 10 years. There's actually a prominent individual in this space who has argued that all life will be extinct in 10 years because of this catastrophic release of methane and runaway warming. There is no evidence whatsoever for any sort of methane-driven runaway warming scenario of that sort. In fact, methane release is a potential feedback. You warm the permafrost in the Arctic, some of that trapped methane is mobilized, makes it into the atmosphere. It's a positive feedback. It adds to the warming, but it's accounted for in a lot of the modeling exercises, and it doesn't lead to runaway warming. It just increases the warming by a certain amount that's taken into account in our calculations. But there are people who say, no, it's going to cause runaway warming and there's nothing we can do about it. Let me be very clear. That is bad science. That is every bit as bad as the distortions of climate science on the right side of our political spectrum coming from climate change deniers. There's no place for agenda-driven bad science, regardless of what part of the political spectrum it comes from. And we have to recognize that that's a real threat right now. This idea that it's too late to do anything, motivated by a distortion of the scientific evidence.
Yeah, I mean, this doomerism is really frustrating because it takes people who would otherwise, like you said, would be helping us solve the problem, and it just discourages them because they think, what's the point if we're already doomed? Why would I take any action? So it's really.
I've often said that this has done more damage than denial ever could do, because it's actually taking the very people who would be out there on the front lines advancing the cause of climate action.
Yeah, and I would just add that I mentioned earlier that solutions denial is becoming kind of the go-to climate denial lately, and there's a lot of arguments that people are making that the solutions are too expensive, it's going to cost too much to implement these climate policies, when the exact opposite is true, when it's going to cost too much to not take action.
Absolutely.
So Brett, we're at the top of the hour, so do you want to jump back in and close it out for us?
I would absolutely love to, and let me speak on behalf of the hundreds of people that have been tuning in live on YouTube and on our Zoom webinar, Dr. Mann, for saying thank you so much tonight for balancing your expertise with the accessibility of what you've been sharing. One of the most top-rated comments here comes from Melissa, who I think says something that speaks for all of us. I've watched Michael Mann many times. I love him because he explains things where we can all understand. He keeps people's attention, and his book sounds great. Can't wait to read it.
Thank you, Alyssa.
So thank you for helping us frame both the urgency of the challenge as well as the agency we all have in dealing with it. I think that key duality is what you've been emphasizing tonight, and something that we will continue to put forth in our own training and support for our volunteers as well.
Thanks so much, Brett. And thanks again for your work and the work of CCL. We're all in this together, and I feel like we're really now the best position we've been at in years to finally see the action we've been working so hard to make happen. So let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's do it. And for those interested tonight, if you want to share this, for those that couldn't make us live, please go to this top link that's featured on the page. You can join CCL if you're not already a part of our movement with that second link. You can find out more about Dr. Mann's research and all of his phenomenal publications in the past with his website published here. And we know that we didn't get to all questions tonight. So Dana and his team have a wonderful team called the Science Policy Network. That link is here on this slide as well as in the chat. Put any questions that you didn't get enough information to there. They'll make sure to follow up with you and help support your questions. And for all of you joining us tonight, thank you so much for being with us. You are making the difference. We are going to have a phenomenal year ahead, and it's thanks to leaders like each of you and making that difference and shifting the dial. So with that, I'll give it back to you, Dr. Mann, if you have anything else to say. And again, thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks so much. It's been inspiring conversation, such great questions. And I know that the followers out there, CCL, such an amazing community of people from all walks of life who have bonded together to try to make this happen. And look, CCL and all of us, we've been working so hard for so many years. And now we're finally at that moment where we can make this happen. So don't stop. We need to keep on doing what we're doing. We need to make sure that we continue to hold our policymakers accountable, because look, the inactivists, the fossil fuel interests are still using their immense power and wealth to try to prevent any progress on climate. We need to provide an equal and even greater force forward to overcome it. So let's continue to do that. Let's be the change we wish to see in the world, and let's get this done. Thanks, everyone.